12 minutes left. I'm going to go through very quickly an example with a player named Connor Brown, who is a right winger for the Ottawa Senators. And I will go through this example very briefly, relatively informally, but hopefully for everyone watching, you'll be able to gather the logical reasoning and the oral advocacy approaches that we are looking for in a competition like this, and really how to approach a case in hockey arbitration, how to put together all the pieces so that you have something to deliver. So Connor Brown is a right winger for the Ottawa Senators, and he entered the league prior to the 2015-16 season. He started his playing career in the NHL for the Toronto Maple Leafs, where in his first season, he played 7 games as a late season addition to the Major League roster. The next season, he became a regular forward for the Maple Leafs, playing in all 82 games, a feat which he repeated for each of the next 3 seasons. So in 2016-17, he played 82 games. In 2017-18, he played 82 games. 18-19, 82 games. And in 19-20, he played 71 games. But it is important to note for the arbitrator that the 1920 season was a COVID-shortened season in which the Ottawa Senators, the team that Connor Brown had been traded to, only played 71 games. Therefore, he played in a full season for the 4th straight time in his career. And that is something that is extremely important to note as we start to see some of the themes for Connor Brown's arbitration case here. He is a consistent and durable player. He is always on the ice contributing to his team. When you look at his points per games played, that last column right there, you can see that Connor Brown has been remarkably consistent for his first 3 full seasons, and then shows tremendous potential in his most recent season, which we call the platform year, or the PY. Just to define some of those terms, the PY, or the platform year, is the most recently completed season prior to arbitration. And given that this arbitration for Connor Brown happens in the summer of 2020, the most recently completed season for Connor Brown is the 2019-2020 season, which is his platform year. When we refer to the 2018-19 season, which is the year before the most recently completed year, we'll be referring to that as the PY minus 1 year, the 17-18 season as the PY minus 2 year, so on and so forth. And that is kind of the nomenclature that you can use in your oral arguments as a shorthand to refer to the years. And that is something that is really important because depending on which players you choose as your comparable players to, in this case, Connor Brown, those years will look different, because while Connor Brown is entering arbitration after the 2020 season, a comparable player, for example, Andre Burakovsky, might have entered arbitration at a different year. And so to compare a 2019-20 season to someone who might not have a 2019-20 season because his contract negotiation happened before that season, you would have to say that you're looking at the PY year rather than the exact season. So, for example, if a comparable player's most recently completed season or their platform year is 2018-19, that platform year is comparable to Connor Brown's 2019-2020 season, because that's Connor Brown's platform year. So make sure you're always comparing like for like. So with Connor Brown, those themes are very, very present. Durable, always contributing, showing tremendous upside. And you can see with his career trajectory that it is going up. And this shows that it's a player on the rise. And trajectories are very, very important in hockey arbitration, because we're looking to those past contributions, those statistics for the player, in order to fairly compensate and place the player in the marketplace for the upcoming season. And so we would respectfully request Connor Brown to receive a salary of, say, $3.75 million based on some of the comparable players that will be chosen. And to do that, we will be looking at some of the statistics that you can see here in comparison to some of the comparable players that we'll choose, um, such as Kevin LeBanc, such as Valerie Nichushkin, and such as Andre Burakovsky, just to see how Connor Brown stacks up. And without going into all of those players, I'll just go through one example here to demonstrate how that comparison might be done. So when we look at Connor Brown and Kevin LeBanc, for starters, we can see that Connor Brown is relatively comparable to Kevin LeBanc, but perhaps on just a slightly lower level. So Kevin LeBanc's statistics are not shown there, but Connor Brown throughout his 4+7 games in one season has played in slightly more games and has recorded 142 total points, whereas Kevin LeBanc has recorded 149 points in 284 games. So the big important number here to use in this case is 0.44 points per games played for Connor Brown and 0.52 points per games played for Kevin LeBanc. And that shows that Kevin LeBanc has a slightly higher points per game production, which is not the only thing that is significant, but when you look at everything as a whole, it starts to form an argument as to where Kevin LeBanc should be placed. Where Connor Brown should be placed in comparison to Kevin LeBanc. So while Kevin LeBanc has scored slightly more points per games played, the other side of the ice, which is the defense, is also extremely important. And when we look at a defensive metric such as plus minus, and depending on how you feel about plus minus, a different stat you could use blocks per games, or one of the more telltale signs of how a team's coach treats a player defensively is whether or not that player is asked to defend in one of the most difficult situations in a hockey game, which is in a shorthanded situation. And a shorthanded situation is when your team is on is penalized so that you are down to 4 skaters while the other team has 5 skaters on a power play. And so when we look at shorthanded time on ice per game, for example, Connor Brown has logged on average throughout his career a little over 2 minutes per game. And this means that he is asked to defend in shorthanded situations because the stats would suggest he is a very strong defensive player. On the other hand, Kevin LeBanc, throughout his career, has logged just under 3 seconds a game, which means when a penalty occurs, Kevin LeBanc is off the ice almost immediately. And that shows the difference that Connor Brown as a forward is a well-rounded forward on both sides of the ice, whereas Kevin LeBanc is relied on more heavily for his scoring, but in a telltale defensive situation, such as a shorthanded situation, Kevin LeBanc is not relied on to contribute in that case. And so given some of these defensive contributions, you can start to see that the difference between Connor Brown and Kevin LeBanc, despite the 0.08 points per game throughout their careers, is not as significant as that number might suggest. Now, aside from looking at a career number, and remember that when we're looking at career numbers, it is a career to platform year number, which means it's only up to that point for a player's comparison, because and that distinction is significant because as we record this now in this information session, it is the year 2022. And so if you go and look at any, stats sites. Connor Brown will have stats for the year 2020-21 as well as the year 2021-22. Those numbers are not relevant in this arbitration because we're casting ourselves back to the time when Connor Brown is entering arbitration, which is after the 2019-2020 season, but before the 2020-21 season. And so when we're talking about quote unquote career numbers, it's better to refer to it as career to platform year numbers and look at that chunk before the arbitration. And that becomes even more relevant for comparable players. So with Kevin LeBank's example, for example, he, might have entered arbitration just like Connor Brown after the 2019-20 season, in which case his career to platform year numbers only would go up and including the 2019-2020 season. So in addition to the career to platform numbers that I've just discussed, another important consideration in the comparison between Connor Brown and a comparable player such as Kevin LeBanc is to really look at the platform year because any sport, if you've been a fan of any sport, but even if you've been a fan of, a music artist or whatever the case might be, it's really a world of what have you done for me lately? And so that's why we look at the most recently completed season or the platform year to look at the contributions of the player to assess best what type of player he is now, not just 2 or 3 years ago. So this plays a significant part in the trajectory of a player because if they peaked, for example, in their career platform sample, in their PY -2 or PY -3 year and have been going down ever since, their value would definitely be lower to a similarly comparable player who had their peak in their platform year and has been climbing ever since leading up into the platform year because it shows a player on the rise. And when you're trying to assess their salary for the upcoming year, you want to make sure that you can make that argument so that they're compensated for that trajectory or penalized for a negative trajectory. And so when you look at the platform year between Kevin LeBanc and Connor Brown, you can see that Connor Brown, for example, logged 20 minutes of ice time versus Kevin LeBanc 16. You can see that he was in a shorthanded situation 2.5 minutes versus LeBanc's 2 seconds. -6 on a plus minus, which although it's a negative, it's all relative because Kevin LeBanc recorded a -33. And even in the offensive category where Kevin LeBanc has been better career-wise or career to platform-wise, Connor Brown in the platform year recorded 0.61 points per games played, as you can see there in the last row, whereas Kevin LeBanc recorded a 0.47 points per games played. And it shows that Connor Brown in his platform year has peaked higher than Kevin LeBanc did in Kevin LeBanc's platform year. And that also becomes a relevant consideration. And so to sum up all of these comparisons, and you can jump into more stats if you want to. You can look at actual goals. You can look at blocks per games. You can look at takeaways, whatever it is, and whatever value you think a player is bringing. And that really, really depends on what type of player that player is. And the type of player is not as objective as you might think because you can look at the stats and say, Connor Brown is, a well-rounded player, a two-way forward, which is very valuable to be able to play offensively and defensively. But one can also look at Connor Brown and say, he's a jack of all trades and a master of none. He's above average in offense and above average in defense, but he's not, elite in either. So it really depends on how you want to frame a player's career. And there really is no wrong answer as long as you can make a genuine argument, one that, you've got to believe in yourself before you can try to convince anyone else of it. And so when you look at all of these, the exercise at the end of the day is to state what salary you think the assigned player, in this case Connor Brown, should receive. And as I think I mentioned, I threw out the number $3.75 million. And when we look at Kevin LeBanc and what he got after his platform season, he signed a 4-year deal for $4.725 million. Now, the way we deal with contracts is interesting, and this will all be in kind of the case memo package that you receive. But a 4-year contract is longer than what we're asking for here with Connor Brown, which is a 1-year contract. And so a 4-year contract, because of the length, um, will often maybe be a little higher, or lower, depending on what the circumstances are. And so you have to be able to make that argument as to how to treat a comparable player's contract as well. And in this case, we will argue that Kevin LeBanc's contract, if he had signed a 1-year deal instead of a 4-year deal, would have been at a higher valuation, because Kevin LeBanc, as a player in his career, with a slightly downward trajectory entering his after his platform year and entering his contract negotiations, probably wanted security. He wanted a longer contract, and he was willing to sacrifice some value for it. And so if he did sign a 1-year deal, it probably would have been higher than 4.725. And given how similar Connor Brown is to Kevin LeBanc, it makes sense for Connor Brown to get a 1-year contract that is a decently high value. And so 3.75 in the player side's opinion is something that is very, very reasonable. And so at the end of the day, the exercise is, suggest a salary that you think the player should receive. And depending on whether or not you're representing the player or the club side, the comparable players you use will change. And that creates a different anchor, whether it's lower or higher, for the player's salary. And in the vast majority of cases, the two sides will be different enough for an arbitration to occur. And if both sides are doing their jobs correctly, the player side will be the higher number and the club side will be the lower number. And once you decide on number based on kind of that marketplace that you assess to be the valid one, then you go through the statistics that you find are relevant for the player's profile, whether or not they're, in Connor Brown's case, a two-way forward, jack of all trades, master of none. He is very strong defensively, and that's what he's known for, plus some upside on the offense. Whatever you want to frame him as, I mentioned he's a durable player, so he's kind of an everyday guy who eats up minutes. Like, that is also something of tremendous value. So whatever you want to frame his profile and his themes as, that's what you got to stick with, and then use those themes to drive your comparison with the other comparable players. So you look at Kevin LeBanc and you say, Connor Brown's a two-way forward, Kevin LeBanc is not. That should represent something. And, the value that we're slapping on it is, a $500,000 bonus, like whatever it is. And so you start building the value, you start adding, you start subtracting, and it should get to the number that you advocate for, because that is truly what you are asking for. And that's how you would back it up. So make sure you're using those stats to draw a very clear roadmap from point A, which is kind of the player's objective statistics. As you can see here, games played, goals, assists, points, plus minus, points per games played, ice time, everything I've mentioned, like all of those are objective stats. All of those are stats you find on NHL.com. Like, someone is tallying them, and there's no dispute as to how many games he played. But the way you frame it, right, it is very, very different, depending on who's looking at that. The 16 goals for Connor Brown in the platform year, that could be good, that could be bad. The 8 goals in 2018-19 could be good, could be bad, because maybe it's a dip. But his overall points went up. So depending on how you want to frame it, there's an argument always to be made on both sides. And so when you start to look at those stats, you're drawing a very clear roadmap for the arbitrator presenting this case to say, this is these are the stats, and because of A, B, C, D, and E, this is the number the salary that the player should receive. And you do that a couple of times, depending on how many comparable players you find most fitting. And you present the case to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator will have questions. They'll want to challenge you, or they will just want to seek some clarification to make sure they're understanding the case properly. And depending on what it is, you have to know the case well enough in order to support your arguments, make sure you stand your ground when it's appropriate, make sure you're able to say, you don't know something if you really don't know, because sometimes it would just be out of the scope, or maybe you don't know it but it's not relevant, and you can say that very respectfully. Or if the arbitrator points out a really, really good point, something that is a weakness in your argument, don't be afraid to concede that point, but then back it up and say, I can see that point, or like, that's a great point, Mr. or Miss Arbitrator, but here's why it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter that Kevin LeBanc doesn't kill penalties because he is such a great offensive threat, for example. Like, whatever it is, make sure that you know when to stand your ground, when to give additional clarification, when to concede, but ultimately everything you do should be in service of your argument, because at the end of the day, as a sports lawyer, as a lawyer, as someone who's an oral advocate, you want to make sure you are, advocating for the best interests of your client, whether that's the player or the club. So with that, I think that will conclude kind of this example part. The next slide is just questions. So if anyone has any questions, or if Matt, there's anything I've missed, let me know, and I'm happy to answer them right now.
Yeah, thanks so much.